China doesn't have any of that. None of it. There's no significant Chinese bond market. They don't have the infrastructure of banks and dealers I described. They don't have the physical infrastructure. And most of all, they don't have a rule of law. You can't trust the Chinese as far as you can throw them. I was a facilitator and then a participant in the first ever financial war game ever conducted by the Pentagon. We did this at a top secret location called the Warfare Analysis Laboratory. One of the things we did there, I was on the China team. I wanted to make it realistic. So I said, let's lie, cheat, and steal, because that's what Wall Street does. And that's a more realistic game. So I recruited a friend of mine who's fluent in Russian to be on the Russian team. And I had dinner with him before we went down to the laboratory. And I said, look, here's the plan. I'm going to persuade my China team colleagues to basically announce a new gold standard. And we've accumulated enough gold, and we're going to say, for now on, our currency is backed by gold. We're going to put the gold in Switzerland to keep everybody happy. We're going to issue notes from a bank created in London under English laws to keep everybody happy. Here's the thing. We're going to say, from now on, if you want our exports, you have to pay for us in this new currency. We're not taking dollars anymore. And furthermore, and if you want some of this new currency, you can deposit your gold in Switzerland and the bank will issue you some currency, so you're in the system. Or you can trade with us and run a surplus, and then we'll pay you in the currency and you can use that to buy our stuff, or we'll give you loans. But one way or another, we're done with the dollar. And obviously this is very forward leaning, but the whole idea of a war game is to help the Pentagon think 5 or 10 years ahead. So the first thing that happened when you go to your embassy or conclave, you come out and you stand up at the podium, you announce your plans, and then everybody reacts and it's discussed, et cetera. The first thing that happened is there was a group. So we had the red team, the yellow team, the blue team, as the case may be, and they're all different countries or areas. But there's a white team, which are the referees. They decide what you did. And the first thing they did when we announced the gold move, they ruled it as an illegal move. They said, no, that's not in any of our scenarios. You can't do that. And I stood up, and about 100 people in the room. There's 3-star generals, CIA, FBI. I said, wait a minute. I said, this is a war. There are no illegal moves in a war. The whole idea is to be out of the box or live in a world where there are no boxes. That's what we're doing here. So they agreed. They said, okay, we think it's a really dumb idea, but we'll let you do it. Well, over the course of 2 days, it accelerated and gathered momentum. At the end of it, Russia got PowerPoints. Okay, so this was 2009. Within 10 years, so what facts happened? Within 10 years, Russia tripled its gold reserves. Last week, the dollar value of Russia's gold exceeded the dollar value of its treasury securities. They have 20% of their reserves in gold, and the value of their gold is more than the value of the U.S. treasury securities. They're dumping treasuries, buying gold. Exactly what we warned the Pentagon about 10 years ago. And here it is, and China has more than tripled its reserves. So we're not there yet, but we're moving to some kind of gold-backed world. But the point is, that was all in the war game. That's all in the book. And I made one other point. I said, currency wars don't happen all the time. They might only happen twice in a century. But when they happen, they can last for 10 or 15 years. That's how long it takes to sort out. What you describe about the Chinese money supply is absolutely correct. People in the United States complain, the Federal Reserve has printed $4 trillion in the past year. And they have printed $4 trillion in the last year. They're taking the Fed balance sheet from about 3.5 trillion to 7.5 trillion. So yeah, we printed $4 trillion in the past year. Didn't do any good, won't do any good, but we did it. But Chinese money supply is even larger and growing faster. Now, I don't want to get into the weeds on China's internal monetary policy. I could, except to say that they're grossly overleveraged. The economy is investment-driven, not consumption-driven. They're about 45% investment. The U.S. is about 25% investment. So that gives you some idea of how investment is to the Chinese, which is actually okay if you're investing in productive assets that pay the way. They're not. They're wasting the money. I've been to China many times, been going back and forth there for 35 years. I've been out in the countryside. I don't just stick to the hotel lobby in Beijing. I got mud on my boots visiting these ghost cities. And so each ghost city, there are a bunch of them, actually seven. Imagine building 7 cities. That's what I saw. And so they got 1 or 2 skyscrapers, and they got mixed use, and they got retail shopping, a country club, a hotel, a golf course, a pond, highway stops, airport, etc. And it's all empty. I mean, it's just all empty. Shiny new construction, some of it still under construction, all empty. So I said to the communists, I said, what are you guys doing here? I mean, nobody's here. So, oh, don't worry. People will be coming from the countryside and they will be populating these cities. And I said, when? I said, no one's coming. And besides that, you've already drained the countryside. That already happened. But I said, you cannot mothball a building. It's not like some old clothes. I mean, the way a building maintains itself, it gets occupied and there's maintenance and people fix it and all that. I visited, I used to travel a lot in Central Africa in the early 80s. Zaire at the time, today it's the Congo. I was in Kinshasa, but it was right after the 70s commodities boom. And they took the money, of course they wasted it, and they built these skyscrapers in Kinshasa, which is like a swampy, scary, funky, city. But there's a skyscraper, but the windows are falling out and there were rust stains running down the side and the elevators were broken. So it might have looked nice the day they built it, but it was never really used. And now it was literally, when I was there, it wasn't that much later after they built it, it was falling apart. So that's going to happen in China. My point being, if you apply, generally accepted accounting principles to their investment account, you would write it off the day they open the building because nobody's there. It's not worth anything. So they're wasting the money. They're over leveraged. They're overprinted. However, none of that has anything to do with the status of the Chinese yuan as a global reserve currency. The yuan is not a reserve currency. It will not be, probably in my lifetime, maybe never. And I'll tell you why. Because a lot of people don't understand what a reserve currency really is. You get a report from the IMF and it says, 60% of global reserves are in dollars, which is true, and about 25% are in euros, which is true. So 85% of global reserves are in dollars or euro, which means the only meaningful exchange rate in the world is the euro-US dollar cross rate. Everything else is working around the edges. You got some sterling and yen and Swiss francs and a couple other things. Aussie dollar is tiny, believe it or not, good currency, but not a big part of it. And China's like this kind of invisible 1% sliced down at the bottom. And China has $1.4 trillion in its reserves. But here's the point. It's not as if they have pallets of $100 bills stacked up in the basement of the People's Bank of China. They don't. You invest in securities. In other words, they're dollar-denominated securities. So it's not actually dollars. They're treasury bills, notes, and bonds denominated in dollars. So the thing that makes a reserve currency is not the currency, it's the bond market. You need something to invest in. Again, so you need a liquid bond market with different maturities, different interest rates. You need dealers, you need auctions, you need payment and clearance systems, you need repo or repurchase agreements, futures, options, when issued trading, custodians. The rule of law, there's a whole massive infrastructure, which we started working on when Alexander Hamilton was, advising George Washington, and we've been doing it ever since. And others, Bank of England has done the same. China doesn't have any of that, none of it. There's no significant Chinese bond market. They don't have the infrastructure of banks and dealers I described. They don't have the physical infrastructure. And most of all, they don't have a rule of law. You can't trust the Chinese as far as you can throw them. And so they have no chance of being a global reserve currency, none. Same with the Russian ruble, same with a lot of other currencies, same with Bitcoin. Show me the Bitcoin bond market. Maybe you can get my attention, but not sooner. So none of those are going to replace the dollar. First thing, my wife hates me to admit this, but I was once a registered lobbyist in Washington. I ran an office there. I spent a lot of time on Capitol Hill. And the first thing I learned in Washington is you can't beat something with nothing. In other words, if you hate a policy or a program, you just hate it, you write op-eds, fine. You're not going to change it unless you bring something to replace it. So for all the criticisms of the dollar, and there are plenty of them, you're not going to dethrone the dollar as the leading global reserve currency unless you can show me what you're going to replace it with. And there's one and only one contender in the world today, which is gold. So that's a whole other conversation. I'm not saying we're going to be on a gold standard tomorrow. As far as China's concerned, China's a house of cards. It's going to collapse. It's going to be ugly. Hard to say when, but probably sooner than later. And they know it. And they're not going to be a global reserve currency. So we can put China to one side, but China's a house of cards. Now, getting it back to the United States, the first point, let's talk about stimulus first. So the Fed printed $4 trillion. Congress, we had $1 trillion, what are called baseline budget deficits going into the pandemic. So with no pandemic, we were going to have $1 trillion deficit in 2020 and 2021. Now, Congress put $3 trillion on top of that with rescue and bailout programs last March, April, and May. That was the CARES program, payroll protection plan, aid to hospitals, extended unemployment benefits, higher unemployment benefits, etc. I'm not saying any of those things were bad. It was needed to keep things from getting a lot worse. But we put $3 trillion on top of this. So there's $4 trillion for fiscal 2020. They just did $1 trillion last week in the kind of final days of the Trump administration. So that's $5 trillion. And Biden has announced his plan. He's going to have a $2 trillion rescue bailout, so-called stimulus plan now. So that's $7 trillion plus the $1 trillion baseline for fiscal 2021. So there's $8 trillion in deficit spending in 2 fiscal years, $4 trillion of money printing by the Fed. Now, those are the numbers. That's not projections. That's baked in the pie. Just don't call it stimulus. It will have no stimulative effect. Does it, again, as I say, keep the lights on? Yes. Would just some people keep their jobs last spring because their employer got payroll protection plans? Yes. Did other people benefit from increased unemployment benefits? Yes. Was a lot of that necessary because things were in such bad shape? Yes. So I'm not arguing that side of it, but it does not stimulate. It's not going to get us out of the depression. Let me be very specific as to why, because I don't make claims without backing it up. On the money supply, you can print all the money you want, but Milton Friedman was wrong. The monetarists are wrong. The Austrian school is wrong. Money printing does not cause inflation. What causes inflation is something called velocity, which is the turnover of money. The money has to be lent and spent. Banks have to be lenders. People and businesses have to be borrowers. You have to be spending it, get it in circulation, in other words, in order to potentially to have some inflation. And that's the technical name for that is velocity. Velocity is dropping, sinking like a stone. And by the way, it's been dropping since 1998. It dropped faster in the 2008 crisis. It's dropping faster today, but the trend has been very steeply down for the last 22 years. And so, nominal GDP, so the dollar value of all goods and services, leaving aside inflation, that's what we mean by nominal value. Nominal value of gross domestic product is money supply times velocity. How much money is there and how much does it turn over? Multiply one by the other, and that's your nominal GDP. And I remind people that $7 trillion times zero is zero, meaning you can print the $7 trillion, but if you don't have any velocity, you don't have an economy. And so you can understand monetary policy is a desperate race between increasing money supply and declining velocity. One offsets the other so that you barely keep nominal GDP where it is. In fact, it's going to go down about 6 or 7%. We're not getting back to 2019 levels of output. If you take 2019 as your baseline, we're not getting back to 2019 levels till 2023 at the earliest. We're not getting back to 2019 levels of job creation, the number of people who have jobs, until 2025 at the earliest. That's why I call it a depression, not a recession. Now flip over to fiscal policies. Like, hey, they're sending everybody $2,000 checks, and they are. The people are going to get those checks. And so the Wall Street, which usually gets things wrong. That's the first thing you got to know about Wall Street, because they don't really care about you. They care about rap fees and how they make money. So they're saying, all right, they're going to send out the $2,000 checks, and people are going to get those checks, and they're going to run right out. And they're going to buy a car, a refrigerator, paint the kitchen, whatever it may be. No, the first two things are true. They're going to spend the money, and they're going to borrow the money, and they're going to send people the checks. But when people get the checks, they're not spending it. What they're doing, they're saving it. They're either paying down debt, which is equivalent to savings, or they're putting the money in the bank, which is savings. So certainly if you lost your job, you're not going to take your friends out to dinner. You're going to throw the money in the bank or pay the rent. But even if you didn't lose your job, you look around, like maybe your spouse lost his job. Maybe your neighbor lost his job. Maybe you think you're next, like you have a job, but you're worried you're going to get fired next week. So you save it. And the name for that, economists call that precautionary savings, or, plain English, it's saving for a rainy day, except it's raining everywhere. So they are going to send the checks out, but people aren't going to spend it. And that's the reason you're not going to get the stimulative effect, but you are going to increase the deficit, which gets back to this debt to GDP ratio. So take the total debt divided by GDP. That's some ratio. The research is very convincing, very clear. A number of studies show this, that up to about 90%, so 90% debt to GDP, you get a little bit of something called a Keynesian multiplier, meaning you borrow $1, you spend $1, and you get $1.10 of GDP, or you get $1.05 of GDP. And it works maybe temporarily, but it works when people won't spend the money the government can. That's the idea. But when the debt to GDP ratio goes above 90%, that's what physicists call a critical threshold or a phase transition. Now you're through the looking glass. Now the Keynesian multiplier drops below 1, meaning you borrow $1, you spend $1, but you only get 90 cents of GDP. But meanwhile, the debt went up $1. So what's happening to the debt to GDP ratio? This is going up dollar for dollar, but this is going up 90 cents on the dollar. So the ratio is getting worse. Guess what the US debt to GDP ratio is today? The answer is it's about 135%. So we're way past that 90% threshold. And by the way, who's in that club? I can tell you, Lebanon, Greece, and Italy. So there's your lunch table for four, the four super debtors league. And it just gets worse. And that ratio past 90% is a headwind to growth, because people look at it and are like, hey, I don't have a PhD in economics, but I just don't like what I see. And people understand correctly, and this is the behavioral adaptation that policymakers on Wall Street do not understand. But the behavioral adaptations, people look at it and say, I don't know how this is going to end, but it's going to end. We're either going to have a default, or we're going to have something like hyperinflation to make the debt go away, or they're going to raise my taxes. Not sure which, maybe all of the above, but I have to save more money to meet my lifetime goals in the face of some bad outcome that's going to come out of this. That's the real world behavior, and economists know very little about the real world. So the point is, increasing the money supply doesn't work because velocity is declining. Increasing deficits doesn't work because people are saving, not spending, and they're preparing for worse outcomes. So neither one of these, you can call it money printing or spending, but don't call it stimulus, because it doesn't stimulate. We're not getting out of this. And that's why I call my book The New Great Depression.